I've heard it said before, like, it was a very smart man named Robert Meyer Burnett who said the currency of our current age is authenticity. And it's so true.
I was off duty, sitting in my buddy Barney Ross's Speak at Van Buren in Plymouth, drinking rum out of a coffee cup when two guys shouldered in, looking like hoodlums. I was almost right. It was Mayor Cermak's bagman bodyguards, Harry Lang and Harry Miller, the two Harrys. His Honor's two-man hoodlum squad, heavy set and as anonymous as a couple gorillas at Lincoln Park Zoo, only uncaged.
Hiya, Red. Heard you hung out here.
Red wasn't my name. Heller was. Nathan Heller. Nate to my friends, who these two definitely were not. Miller was cleaning the fog off his Coke-bottled glasses. I knew him a little. Lang, too. We were all Maxwell Street boys. They were just older, and fatter, and even more dishonest.
Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, your Duke of Dope Discourse, your master of fun and wonder, your viceroy of verisimilitude, your sommelier of sci-fi and cinema, your evangelist of the imagination, and of course, your existential Mr. Rogers, whatever that means. Me, Robert Meyer Burnett, and I'm Rob-casting it you imagination connoisseurs, you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity community. This is Robservations episode 991. My God, inexorably we are marching. We are going to the end. We are going to the 1000th. Wait. I don't mean to say that's the end of the show. It's the end of the march to the 1000th show. And as you know, it's going to be about you. I've already had emails. People are sending me. I'm going to schedule. You imagination connoisseurs, if you want to be on the 1000th show, you have to email me a topic we'll discuss, and you have a half an hour. It's like a membership call when everyone gets like 7 minutes in heaven, but you get 30 minutes. We will talk. We will have a conversation. I will interview you, but you can't do it under like some Avi. You have to be here, present. I want to see your beautiful face. I want you to come on. We're going to have a conversation. And the show is going to be 1,000 minutes long. And I don't care who or what you are. I don't care what shape, size, color, creed you are. I want to have a conversation with you. Even if we completely disagree, you come on the show. I will provide you a platform. We will have a respectful conversation. How cool will that be? For the 1000th episode, it's all about you imagination connoisseurs. Email me at rmburnett1701@gmail.com. Tell me who you are. Tell me what you want to talk about, and I am putting a schedule together. Now, look, you want to ambush me and be a douchebag? That's fine. You can do that. Cha-ching! I don't have to keep you here for a half an hour. It's still my show, Bear, if you're a talk radio fan. I want to have a conversation. I want to know what you guys are all about. Let's make the 1000th show of Robservations about you imagination connoisseurs, you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity community. All I ask, give me a topic, tell me what you want to talk about, and make sure that you know I want to see your beautiful face. Let's do it. Anyway, so look, I could talk about, I know there's probably like 6 people here watching this going, what are you going to talk about tonight, Rob? Well, I've been reading a lot of things, a lot of stuff on social media, on Facebook. People are evacuating LA. The entertainment business is in free fall, all that stuff. I feel bad because I'm in the middle. You just heard a little taste of Michael Rosenbaum as Nathan Heller, and something I've been working on for the last, basically all of 2024. I have our feature film White Devils that we finished, that was directed by Gabe Bologna. You know, I'm a producer on that. Gabe Bologna directed Tango Shalom, a.k.a. Forbidden Tango. Forbidden Tango is going to be opening up the Argentina Jewish Film Festival in Buenos Aires in November. Hope I can get down there. I've never been there and want to go. So that's exciting. We got that cooking. And then White Devils, our new movie, coming out. And I do, on a somber note, Steve Yeaman, our sound designer on Tango Shalom, a.k.a. Forbidden Tango, and the man who scored and did the sound design on our upcoming film White Devils. His wife passed away the other day. She lost a battle with cancer, and a big shout out to her. And he did such great work, and I came to know him and respect him, and he really did love his wife immensely. She was the most important person in the world to him, and I just like to acknowledge that she did pass after a valiant, short but valiant battle with cancer. So all my condolences, and shout out to you, Steve. So our hearts go out to you. That said, I'd like to talk about what I did this weekend, but I'm going to save that for another show. Now, here we are. Now, first of all, I want to talk about Upper Deck. Upper Deck, and I just realized I forgot to get what they sent me. So the Upper Deck company, known for their trading cards. The Upper Deck company, they've sent me Marvel prints, which I've shown on this show, an X-Men print. They sent me a beautiful Moon Knight print. They sent me that cool She-Hulk Atlas print they sent me. The Upper Deck company has started doing X-Files cards, Monster of the Week cards, and I just realized I was supposed to put them here. They're not here, but I promise Upper Deck I will show them tomorrow. But they've done this very cool Monster of the Week series of trading cards that also has script pages. You can actually read script pages in trading card form. I've never seen that. Very cool. Love what they're doing. So thank you, Upper Deck. Tomorrow I'm actually going to show the cards, and they're really, really cool. I mean, who doesn't love the Monster of the Week? So when Upper Deck sent these to me, I started thinking about the X-Files was such a big part of the 90s and genre cinema and like really stoking the fire of genre fandom. And it's very funny. In the early 90s, anyone who lived in LA, any geek, I mean, there's a lot of us that think about Los Angeles of the early 90s as Devil's Tower in Close Encounters. We heard this clarion call. You know, we didn't know why. We weren't necessarily building Devil's Towers in our living room or sculpting Devil's Towers out of, aftershave foam or whatever. But we all came to Los Angeles, and there was a singular destination for all geeks, imagination connoisseurs, nerds that were in LA. There was one place that we all gathered around, and that was the Academy of Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Horror Films, the people that give out the Saturn Awards. That was founded by Dr. Donald Reed. And Dr. Donald Reed and Robert Holguin were the people that kept that academy going. And in the early 90s, the academy was the place to be. Not only were you a member, not only did they put on the Saturn Awards, but almost every Sunday, they had a screening series on the USC campus at the beautiful Norris Cinema. And it was almost every weekend they would show 3 movies. And if they weren't screening at USC, they were having other screenings. A lot of the time it was at the Royal in West LA. I saw Heather's there. I took my mom to an Academy screening at the Royal. And a friend of mine named Roger Fenton was the director of special events. And when he kind of stepped down, I was made the director of special events for the Academy of Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Horror Films in the early 90s. I've talked about how at the Royal Cinema, at the screening of David Tui's The Arrival, I would interview filmmakers in the front of the theater. And at the Royal Cinema, we showed The Arrival, and I made the mistake. I was a huge David Twohy fan because in my professional career, when I was hired by Mark Levinson and Scott Rosenfeld, the very first screenplay that I ever read and recommended was David Twohy's The Grand Tour, which, was made into a Showtime movie. And I read it, and I made the mistake of interviewing David Twohy for The Arrival, starring Charlie Sheen as Zane Zeminski and, of course, Ron Silver. And I made the mistake of saying, what's it like to be one of the great B-movie directors of all time? He was pissed. Man, that was a faux fucking paw of the first degree. I should not have said B-movie. I mean, I meant that with great respect, but he didn't know that. And recently, Kino Lorber announced his movie Below is coming out. Just so if you have any doubts, I mean, I show this on Let's Get Physical Media. I fucking love Chronicles of Riddick, and how now he's making the fourth one, Furion. So David Twohy, I apologize for 30 years ago calling you a B-movie director at that screening at the Royal of The Arrival, which I love. But anyway, I work for the Academy of Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Horror Films. I said to Dr. Reed, one of the great things about the Academy of Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Horror Films is that James Cameron and Gail Ann Hurd were big supporters, and I got to interview both of them in front of audiences at the Norris Cinema. One of the greatest moments of my young career was I had suggested that James Cameron bring down the director's cut, the extended edition of The Abyss, because I'd heard they'd made a print of it. And he himself brought down prints to USC, to Norris, in 1984 of The Terminator, and they showed it there. He brought him down, so he was a big fan, and The Abyss, and of course now we had the director's cut, Aliens in The Abyss, and now there was the director's cut of The Abyss. So I had suggested that he come down and show it. And of course, now that I was the newly minted director of special events, I think it was Robert Holgren who called me and said, okay, Bob, you are going to interview James Cameron. I hadn't started doing DVD special features yet. This is early 90s. I'd never interviewed any filmmakers. I was not the critic at large for Sci-Fi Universe. I was fucking terrified. And anyway, so there's like 500 seats at Norris. The day they showed The Abyss, people were sitting in the aisles. It was it was the director's cut of The Abyss. And I've told this story a million times. I'll tell it again right now. I'm interviewing James Cameron on stage at Norris, at USC, the greatest film school in the world, in front of all the students and former students. I was a former student. And I had spent weeks researching James Cameron's career and reading every issue of Cinefex and any interview I could find. I had to go to the Academy Library. And so I introduced him. And I said, in 1984, all of us here probably went to a theater to see The Terminator. And 108 minutes later, or whatever I said, we all walked out of that theater thinking, who is this James Cameron and what is he going to do next? And to tell us, please welcome James Cameron. He comes out, everyone's like, ah! Even I was like, fuck yeah. He walks out on the stage, and I don't remember the actual numbers anymore because it's been a long time since I told this story. I said like 108 minutes or something. You know what? I said 100 minutes. 100 minutes. After 100, and James Cameron looks at me and he goes, he has the microphone. 600 people in Norris. I'm nervous as hell. He looks at me and he goes, well, if you left The Terminator after 100 minutes, you missed the last 8 minutes of the film because The Terminator is actually 108 minutes long. And the entire audience erupts into laughter. I'm completely discredited, but I still have to sit on stage and interview him for an hour. Now, maybe that's white people problems or whatever, but let me tell you, as a young whippersnapper like myself in the early 90s, interviewing James Cameron at USC in front of hundreds of people, I've already been discredited. That's when you have to man up, man. You can't, no tail between your legs. You have to sit down. I had to take a deep breath. I knew what I was going to ask him. I knew I was ready. I sat down. I think I interviewed him for 30 or 40 minutes and then turned it over to the audience. Longest 30 or 40 minutes of my life. But you know what? When it was over, James Cameron shook my hand, and you know what he said to me? He said, "I very much appreciate how prepared you were for this interview." Bruh, come on. That was a fucking Victory. Not like the Jackson's victory tour. That was my victory tour. James Cameron complimented me. It was fantastic. And then, of course, I've won a Saturn Award. Actually, I've won 3, but this was mine. Best direct-to-video release of 1999 for my film Free Enterprise. Star Trek documentaries that we worked on won 2 Saturns, consecutive years. Why am I telling this story? Is it self-aggrandizing? Yes. But what I'm leading up to is, as the director of special events in the 90s and the aughts, I was very much in favor with the Academy. Maybe not so much these days. I don't quite know why, but, that happens. Things change. But every year I would go to the Saturn Awards, and a lot of the time I would cut videos, video packages. I got to cut a video package for Leonard Nimoy's Tribute Award, which is fantastic, a highlight of my life. But one year, they used to seat me with Larry Cohen every year, the director of It's Alive and Black Caesar and The Stuff and God Told Me To and Q, Quetzalcoatl. I loved Larry Cohen. I met him, his daughter. I talked to him year after year after year. I love that guy. He was amazing. He's like, "Hey, it's the kids. He's here again." It was amazing. But one year, and this year was, I want to say 99. It might have been the year that I won the award for Enterprise. I think it was. I got sat at a table with Frank Spotnitz. Frank Spotnitz, X-Files writer. X-Files Fight the Future had come out. And I was at the Saturn Awards, and I was sat at his table. Now, I have to tell you, I was a huge X-Files fan. Huge. Loved it. I loved the X-Files so much. And my friend Steve Melching, we used to go to his house and have these big screenings. On New Year's Eve, we'd watch the Star Wars trilogy, over and over and over again. But before leading up to the X-Files movie, we had multiple screenings of X-Files mythological, the ongoing story, the myth arc of X-Files leading up to the movie, because we knew that the movie was going to pay off the myth arc that they had been telling for 4 years. And I have to say, I was dating a girl named Cheryl Stanley, who became a very powerful executive at ABC. I don't know what she's doing now, but she was a beautiful, very sexy woman who's way smarter than I was. But I met her at a convention, and we went. She was like, "Oh, I understand, how much you're going to love this." And I was telling her all about the X-Files, and she wasn't a big fan, but, we went. Cheryl Stanley and I went and saw X-Files Fight the Future. And she thought, okay, she's indulging me. I'm a big fucking nerd. She's much more highly educated than me and higher up in the industry than I was. But I didn't tread on that. I actually liked her. I didn't think of what she could do for me in my career. I just liked her. She's a beautiful girl, great body, smart as fuck, smarter than me. And she decided to go to see X-Files with me because she knew I wanted to see it. What's not to love? She's married and has kids. It's all fine. I haven't ever asked her for a job. Anyway, she's cool. Her last name's no longer Stanley. I forget what it is. But She was amazing, and she went to see X-Files. Why am I talking about this? But anyway, so we go to the movie, and I'm sitting there, and by the end of that film, I was seething with anger. I was so angry. Now, you have to understand, X-Files Fight the Future was directed by Rob Bowman, and I was a huge fan of Rob Bowman because he cut his teeth on Star Trek The Next Generation. He directed Q-Who, the first episode with the Borg. He directed Elementary Dear Data. They built him a whole set to do that. I mean, he was a guy. I got to interview him for the Star Trek The Next Generation documentaries. Big fan of his. He directed Reign of Fire. Seriously, he did. Reign of Fire. But he directed X-Files Fight the Future. Now, here's the thing about X-Files Fight the Future. When I saw that film, I realized the people that were making X-Files didn't know fuck all. They had no idea what their show was about. It was all made up. All my illusions. I was like, oh my God, I was so like, these guys are they're gonna tell us about the alien conspiracy. We're gonna get shit we'd never know. It's gonna blow our minds. By the end of that movie, I was fucking pissed. And I don't know what Cheryl thought of me at the time. I really don't. You know, I thought maybe I should call her up and ask her, but she's like, yeah, we dated 30 years ago. What the fuck do you want? I can't do that. But I wanted to ask her, hey, what did you think of X-Files Fight the Future? Did you understand why I was pissed? But anyway, I was pissed. I was watching this like, these motherfuckers are not paying attention to their own goddamn mythology. And then it made me realize, I mean, I'd become, now, okay. To be honest, first season of X-Files, I kind of missed out. I watched episodes like Gender Bender, talk about being ahead of the curve, am I right? Which I liked. I thought there was a lot of intriguing stuff. I probably watched 4 or 5 episodes of the original X-Files, caught it. It was not appointment viewing until the last episode of season 1, which was the Erlenmeyer flask. That's when Deep Throat gets killed, and the alien I watched that episode, I'm like, oh my God. Becky, look at her butt. No, it wasn't that way. I love the Erlenmeyer flask. I'm like, this is fucking dope as fuck. And then I had to go back and watch it in reruns, and I caught up with the X-Files. By the time I think the second season opener is Little Green Men. The Victoria can tell me. I don't know. I just became an X-Files freak. I was totally immersed in the mythology. I'm watching this stuff. And every little detail, I'm going on the forums and reading all about it. I'm like, oh my God, X-Files. I loved it so much. I loved it so much. And, you know, season 2 was dope. Nisa, you had Diane Di-Verletz. I mean, one of the great hours of TV. Demonic teachers. It was so good. Season 3, Nisa and 731. There were so many great episodes of X-Files. God damn, I love that show. Beautifully shot. David Duchovny, Gillian Anderson. What's not to love about the first 4 seasons of X-Files? Until you realize it's all for naught. They don't know what the fuck they're doing. They don't know where they're going. And I watched that fucking movie and I'm disillusioned. What does any of this have to do with the Saturn Awards or Dr. Reed? 1999, I'm sitting at a table with Frank Spotnitz, who co-wrote the X-Files movie. And I'm there. I've made a movie. I'm a professional. I feel like we're on par. We're talking, you know. And the last thing Frank Spotnitz thinks he's going to get is some X-Files freak sitting at a table with him at the Saturn Awards. We're all vetted, right? We've all made some shit, done some stuff. We're professionals. And I'm like, I might as well imagine. Now, I was trying to be like, Mr. Spotnitz, my name's Rob Burnett. Can I ask you a question about the X-Files? You know what he was hearing in his mind? Mr. Spotnitz, my name's Rob Burnett. I'm a huge fan of the X-Files, and I'd like to ask you a question about X-Files Fight the Future. That's what he's thinking. And he's like, he doesn't know what the fuck I'm going to ask. Here's what I ask him. Here's the thing that's been vexing me. I'm terribly vexed, like Commodus and Gladiator. How about that Gladiator 2 trailer? Don't talk to me about the CGI. Jesus Christ. Anyway, so I ask him, I'm like, okay, so in this movie, the premise of X-Files Fight the Future is that the alien conspirators, which, by the way, they never explain, like, if we're human beings, the entire X-Files premise is that there is a consortium of humanity, the elites, that are talking to aliens. They know that there's black oil. They know that there's alien bounty hunters. They know that there's all this stuff. They know there's a day where aliens are going to invade or whatever the fuck's going to happen. And they're trying to carve out a place for themselves and their family in the New World Order. All of this is going on. We've seen it. They've shown it to us in the show. So I asked Frank Spotnitz, I go, Frank, so in the movie, suddenly human beings are gestating, a la Alien, gestating alien creatures in their bodies. And we know that Scully is kidnapped and taken in some technologically advanced sarcophagus, I don't know what the plural is, whatever. And somebody wheels her down into a gigantic alien spacecraft that's in the Arctic. And yet, our conspirators who have a base over this fucking flying saucer, this gigantic flying saucer, like they're all, and there's thousands, tens of thousands of human beings in this flying saucer that are gestating these alien creatures, gray aliens, whatever the fuck they are. We hadn't seen them before, but they're it's become a thing in the movie. I'm like, bro, dude, Frank, Spotnitz, whatever. We don't know each other, but I made a movie and you think I'm not a crazy fanboy. Oh, but you're hearing, hey, Mr. Spotnitz, let me ask you a question now. I get it. I understand how that is. But so, I ask him, I say, Frank, you're asking us to believe that the aliens have a gigantic, huge spaceship with tens of thousands of human beings gestating these alien creatures from the black oil, and the human beings that have a base right above the spaceship, they don't know that the black oil, that they're gestating alien creatures in human hosts, this is new to them? I mean, you haven't said anything about this. I mean, they're like, oh my God, the well-dressed man, the cigarette-smoking man, they're all like, we don't know what's going on. Uh-oh. And Scully has been wheeled down into that spaceship. And I'm like, who wheeled her down there? If somebody took her down there, and somebody did, they had to have seen the tens of thousands of human beings frozen with alien creatures gestating in their chests. And he says to me, Frank Spotnitz says to me, and I'm sure it was like, it wasn't the nerds. I was the parents and Peanuts. Whoa, 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 whoa. He probably didn't even hear what the fuck I was saying. Whoa, whoa. I can't even imagine what I could have been speaking through me, whatever, from Galaxy Quest. He didn't, who knows what he thought I was saying. But I was asking what I thought was a legit question. I mean, I've already interviewed fucking James Cameron on the stage at USC, so I know that I can ask a legit question. I know I can do it. I know it. And I think what I'm asking him is from I didn't mean to put him on the spot. I didn't mean to sound like, I didn't mean to do that. I was saying, how is it that you're now, I've been following what you've been writing for 4 fucking years, and now here is X-Files Fight the Future. Rob Bowman has directed a widescreen X-Files 9/11-esque epic, even though 9/11 hadn't happened yet. Oh my God, government building getting blown up. It was Oklahoma City. I get it. I understand. I get it. I do. I'm following this. I'm trying, but I'm asking him a legit question. I'm like, bro, you're asking me to believe the conspirators who have a base above this flying saucer don't know about any of this? And he tells me, this is what he says. He says, well, those conspirators, they just never went down. They never went down in that flying saucer. And I'm thinking, Frank, someone brought Scully in that sarcophagus down into the flying saucer. He couldn't have left fast enough. He got up. he did not want to sit at a table with someone like me who's going, in his mind, going, Mr. Sputnitz, tell me why this doesn't work. And why in the last 4 years the fucking it doesn't work, the whole mythology. I can only imagine. That's what Frank Spotnitz was thinking. And you know what? He wasn't wrong. He wasn't wrong, because I'm like, I was like waiting. I'm sitting there waiting. When can I? I'm trying to be all cool, like I've made a movie. That, by the way, I was a Saturn Award winner that night. Just saying. And yet, even though I was a Saturn Award winner, let's not forget, from his perspective, Mr. Spotnitz, tell me about the X-Files. It was not good. Not good. This is the dichotomy of being a fan and a professional in the industry. You never know what's going to happen. You don't know. So there's a lead up. I don't know if this gives you context or tells you where I'm coming from now. Frank Spotnitz was a huge fan of Karl Kolchak. And I know some of you know what I'm saying. People are like, oh my God, really? Other people, most of you are going to be like, Karl Kolchak? Who the fuck is Karl Kolchak? Well, I'm here to tell you. So one of the great fantasists of the mid-century of the 20th, Thomas Logan, to the spot. This is not the Spotnitz scream. This is what I was saying to Spotnitz as he's listening to me. I'm imagining this is what Frank Spotnitz is thinking. This is what he's seeing me doing. Mr. Spotnitz, there we go. Or, I mean, I could have been, the Rob Phantom Zone. Mr. Spotnitz, tell me about the X-Files. Anyway, there you go, Thomas. I hope I did the thing for you. Was that good enough? So anyway, Frank Spotnitz is a huge fan of Karl Kolchak. Now, I didn't do a show about this, but I should have. We just passed the 50th anniversary. I want to say it was September 13th. That was September 13th, 1999 was the day that Moon left Earth's orbit in space, 1999. But I want to say that the week after, last week, was the 50th anniversary of Kolchak the Night Stalker. Now, of the TV series, which ran one season. And a lot of you are asking, what TV series? So, Richard Matheson, the writer Richard Matheson, who's one of the great fantasists of the mid-20th century, wrote for The Twilight Zone, wrote for Star Trek, wrote both him and Charles Beaumont, wrote Burn Witch Burn, a.k.a. Night of the Eagle, which is one of my favorite horror films of the early 60s. I was talking about it on Let's Get Physical Media. So Richard Matheson also wrote the first horror novel I ever read, I Am Legend. Yes, the Will Smith movie that was adapted by Akiva Goldsman, but it's been adapted 3 times. One is The Last Man on Earth with Vincent Price, once as The Omega Man with Charlton Heston and Anthony Zerbe, Neville, and then, of course, I Am Legend. Anyway, so Richard Matheson wrote 2 TV movies in the 1970s. And the first of those TV movies was called the early to mid 70s. The ABC, NBC, and CBS, all of them were looking for all kinds of. They would make movies. They were like movie studios, and in addition to the TV shows they made movies. And the first Karl Kolchak movie was called The Night Stalker. No relation to Richard Ramirez, but it was originally broadcast in 1972. And it was based on Jeff Rice's story, The Night Stalker, adapted by Richard Matheson. And The Night Stalker, I'm going to read this from Wikipedia, is an American-made for television horror film, which aired on ABC on January 11th, 1972, as their ABC Movie of the Week. In the film, an investigative reporter, played by Darren McGavin, comes to suspect that a serial killer in Las Vegas is actually a vampire. And spoiler alert, he was right. And it was great. And the movie was so successful that ABC commissioned a second movie. And why this resonated with me was because it was set in Seattle. And the second movie that came out in 1973, a year later, was called The Night Strangler. And, of course, the producer was Dan Curtis, who had done Dark Shadows, who later went on to do War and Remembrance and the Winds of War with Barbara Steele. So The Night Strangler is an American-made television horror film, which first aired on ABC January 16th, 1973, as a sequel to The Night Stalker. In the film, an investigative reporter, Carl Kolchak, assigned to a series of killings, comes to suspect the murderer is an immortal with superhuman strength. And so Carl Kolchak became a character, and then they made a TV series after him called Kolchak the Night Stalker. And in it only lasted, I think it lasted 20 episodes, which it's now celebrating its 50th anniversary because the TV series aired in 74. And Carl Kolchak would go after different supernatural characters. And he was kind of like this. He was kind of like the Columbo of horror. And if you've never seen, you can get Kino Lorber release both the TV movies and the series on disc. You can get them; they're a lot of fun. But Frank Spotnitz loved the show so much. Not only did they bring back Carl Kolchak, they brought back Darren McGavin to play a different character, but he's basically Carl Kolchak. But Frank Spotnitz, the subject of all of this, loved Carl Kolchak, and they brought him back in Stuart Townsend. They tried to do a Night Stalker reboot. You can't do that, man. It just doesn't work, dude. It doesn't work. After fucking X-Files Fight the Future, I'm sorry. I was with you, buddy. I was. But when I saw that TV show, I'm like, come on, dude. But anyway, this doesn't mean I'm slagging off on Frank Spotnitz, because I'm not. I just wanted to give you guys some background about Carl Kolchak. So anyway, let's jump ahead. Let's jump ahead to October 19th, 2017, where Frank Spotnitz has written in Entertainment Weekly an ode, a love letter, call it what you want, a tribute to the Night Stalker. Something that meant so much to him. Because as much as I'm like, he's a fan. He's not trying to do bad. And I think metaphorically, I want everyone to understand this. Most of the people writing RIPs and all the stuff that I slag off on all the time, and you do too, they are also fans. And I think it's important to remember that. But anyway, let me read this article. The Night Stalker, a tribute to the 1972 movie that influenced the X-Files. Frank Spotnitz pens an homage to the film and to Kolchak. Good luck trying to find the Night Stalker. Based on a novel by Jeff Rice, The Night Stalker was written by the late legendary Richard Matheson, Twilight's own I Am Legend, and produced by TV giant Dan Curtis, Dark Shadows and the Winds of War. It broke records when it was broadcast on ABC back in... By the way, Frank Spotnitz wrote this article. It broke records when it was broadcast on ABC back in 1972, drawing a jaw-dropping 54 share and scaring the pants off a generation of viewers, including my then 11-year-old self. By the way, it was not as scary as Don't Be Afraid of the Dark. I'm just saying. It was not that scary. Its success was so enormous that it immediately spawned a sequel, The Night Strangler, and a short-lived TV series, Kolchak the Night Stalker. But neither of those was as powerful as the massive cultural earthquake that was the original Night Stalker. A sort of contemporary noir, it concerned Carl Kolchak, played by Darren McGavin, in a towering performance, a down-and-out reporter in Las Vegas who stumbles upon the story of his career when a string of exsanguinated murder victims leads to only one possible conclusion. The killer is a real-life vampire, Janos Sikorsny, who came to these shores from the old world decades ago and has been claiming victims ever since. The only way to repel Sikorsny is with a cross, and the only way to kill him is with a stake through the heart. Spoiler alert, Kolchak is forced to perform the fatal deed, and for his bravery, the city fathers run him out of town, preferring to bury the truth rather than face it. In the last of his many voiceovers, Kolchak challenges us to convince ourselves it couldn't happen here. I couldn't, and neither could a whole generation of TV viewers. In a TV landscape populated mostly by cops, doctors, and lawyers, The Night Stalker was unlike anything else. It featured an irascible, flawed hero who challenged authority and championed the truth, charming and bribing whomever it took to get it. Its ending was haunting, not happy, and most of all, it was scary as hell. In the 1990s, The X-Files was famously influenced by The Night Stalker to the point that we named a recurring character after Matheson, a senator who aided Agent Mulder in the first 2 seasons, and wrote Darren McGavin himself into the series as Arthur Dales, who first uncovered the FBI's X-Files decades before Mulder and Scully. But today, the Night Stalker DVD is out of print. That's not true anymore, and you won't find it on iTunes, Netflix, Hulu, or Amazon. Even back in 2005, when I attempted a Night Stalker remake, some network execs had either never seen the original or didn't remember that it featured monsters, and to my incredulity, I can't even say that. I can't even say that. Incredulous. It's incredulous with an ITY at the end. Incredulity. And to my incredulity, insisted my version feature none. Imagine that. Frank Spotnitz is trying to make a Night Stalker show without monsters because the network execs don't know what it is. Look, if the network execs has Frank Spotnitz from the X-Files in the office making a Night Stalker show, not knowing, this is, by the way, this is it perfectly exemplifies modern Hollywood. Hey man, why don't we reboot Blade Runner? We've never seen Blade Runner, but I've heard about it. Somebody told me about it once. We should make a new Blade Runner movie. Have you actually looked into how much money it made? Doesn't matter. If I heard about it, it must be amazing. And it must have made a lot of money. Denis Villeneuve's like, I need $175 million. No problem. Anyway, incredulity. Yeah, they didn't know. The fate of the Night Stalker may give me pause to those of us who seek to make television not for the overnights, but for the ages. If a work as towering as The Night Stalker can fall into obscurity, what fate awaits television's giants? It is an injustice that screams to be rectified and doubtless will be. Besides, something as powerful as The Night Stalker could never really die. Its narrative DNA wrapped itself deeply into the imagination of a generation of storytellers who in turn will influence the next generation, and they the next. The Night Stalker lives. Well, Frank, first of all, God bless you, sir, for writing that. That's why I love you. Even if you walked away thinking I was going, I might have sounded like that. I know I probably did. I know. But by God, son, you loved Kolchak the Night Stalker. So did I. I know your show, you were fighting an uphill battle. If you'd just done it in the last 5 years, it would have worked out. You know, I'll tell you something. The 2000s, I think the X-Files started out this, you had the standalone episodes and the myth arc episodes. And I think that all of us who watched X-Files were so involved in the myth arc episodes and where it was going. And for me, it was like finding out that there was a man behind the curtain. It was really upsetting when I saw Cheryl Stanley saw it. She saw my upsetness. When I saw The X-Files, and I saw it in Century City, the theater that's no longer there anymore, where Leonard Nimoy saw my own film, Free Enterprise. When I saw that film there, and it was over, I realized these motherfuckers don't even understand. They don't know their own mythology. And if you bought the soundtrack album for X-Files Fight the Future, with Mark Snow's music, fine. But at the end, there was like a track where Chris Carter is narrating this breathing, this, and then he tells you the whole story. He lays it all out. And the whole conspiracy arc and everything we've been following. He says, oh, here it is. And he lays it out definitively. And the movie even contradicted that. And once you heard that track on the soundtrack album, I'm like, well, why watch the show anymore? And then when they went beyond the show, then they just fucked it up even more. And then, of course, because of the X-Files, we got lost. The TV's we personally got lost. Our entire television culture got lost. But then we got lost. The J.J. Abrams lost. Arguably one of the great pilots in television history. But you know what? That show was a perfect example. I mean, what I was with the X-Files 4 seasons in. I'm like, they know what they're doing. Lost? Nope. Lost was a show. My God. Lost was a show. I came up with the notion of having a fireside chat episode. Like every episode or every season with a show like Lost, they needed a fireside chat episode where all the characters got together like around a fire. And they're like, can you believe we traveled through time? I mean, all the stupid ridiculousness that none of it meant anything. And they finally would sit down, like some of us are traveling through time and some of us are doing this and there's a smoke monster and polar bear. Like no one ever sat down and Lost and went, okay, this is kind of fucked up. And why they didn't? Because the writers never thought to do it because the show was fucking gobbledygook. Gobbledygook. I mean, Lost was the worst thing. By the time you get to that final season, which could have been like John Locke fighting, he was his faith and fighting Matthew Fox or whatever. It would just, the last season of Lost is one of the great audience betrayals in all of television history. I mean, look, I understand the giant butt plug at the bottom of the island, the golden whatever it is, but you know what? That show asked one question. What is the island? What is it? Never answered it. Never answered it. Sidestepped it, just threw gobbledygook. It was just a bunch of bullshit. And I was like, I was in, man. I was in. But then I realized these motherfuckers don't know fuck all about their own show. If I was keeping like a scoreboard, I would have thrown it against the wall and burned my TV. But that was a direct result of the X-Files. I mean, the people that made Lost, oh wait, who are those people? I know. I'll refrain. We all know who they are. We all know what they did. Some people are like, it's so good. No, it's not. Greatest audience betrayal in cinematic history. Here's the thing. The one question that show, I'll answer it for you. Here's what Lost is about. The island in Lost. Listen to your Uncle Rob here. The island in Lost is God's fingerprint on his creation. Yeah, I'm a Jew, but I'm going to go all in on the Old and New Testament. God exists. In the world of Lost, God exists. And the island, God left it. He even signed it. It's his thumbprint on his creation. In all of the infinitudes, the island is a crucible. And anybody who finds their way to that island and goes through all the ridiculously stupid gobbledygook that's on it, but basically it should be the rational and the faithful. And somehow, if you thread that needle and get off the fucking island, you get off the last vestige of it's actual proof God exists. It's on the island. It's a crucible. All human beings who go through that crucible, if they survive and they get off the island, that experience, they're supposed to, they might not know this, but they share that. The people that they have become going through that crucible, they go out into the world, they are to do God's works. Having gone through the experience, they become better people. And the better people they've become, and sometimes maybe they became worse people, you don't know, but that's what God wants. It's all free will. I'm a fan of man. I'm a humanist. But you go out into the world, and hopefully through the experience you had in the island, you bring some insight you would no longer have. The only insight that people have are people that went through that crucible. That's my end of Lost. If I wrote that fucking show, that's what I would have done. Anyway, still, you're probably wondering, what is this show even about, Rob? What are you talking about? What is all of this ridiculous mishigas? And you wouldn't be wrong, because I'm kind of thinking, what is this show about? I don't know. Well, you know I love to read Medium. You know I love to find those articles on Medium. And one of my favorite writers on Medium is a writer named Cole Haddon. And why do I love Cole Haddon? I'll tell you why. Because I did not know that Cole Haddon wrote for Medium until I read his book, Psalms for the End of the World by Cole Haddon. And according to this, look at this. Nicholas Meyer says, mystifying and finally heartbreaking. Fasten your seatbelt. He's not wrong. Who is Nicholas Meyer? Wrote and directed Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Wrote and directed Time After Time, one of the great romantic science fiction thrillers ever made. If you haven't seen Time After Time, what's wrong with you? So Cole Haddon writes for Medium. And so whenever he writes something for Medium, I read it. So I did not know this, but Frank Spotnitz left America. He became an expat. He moved to the UK, and then he moved to France, and then he moved back to the UK. And I was like, wow, I didn't know this, but Cole Haddon wrote an article on Medium that he published 3 days ago, and it was an interview with Frank Spotnitz. And I'm like, I don't bear Frank Spotnitz any ill will. It's not his fault. The X-Files movie made no sense, and it completely disregarded what had happened in 4 years. I'm sure he thinks it didn't, but whatever. I don't. And he remember, here's what Frank Spotnitz thinks of me one more time. Even again, Mr. Spotnitz, let me tell you. That's what Frank Spotnitz thinks of me. I don't think that way of him, but that's how. And by the way, I don't blame him. I don't blame him one little bit. But, so Cole Haddon wrote this article, and I respect Cole Haddon, and whenever he publishes something on Medium, I go run right to it. And by the way, one more time, he's not paying me. I don't even know Cole Haddon. I just know that this book is very much worth your time. People are always asking me to recommend books. Psalms for the End of the World. I know it's a little chonky, but come on, have some attention span, people. Reading is fundamental. So read this book. Anyway, so Cole Haddon interviewed Frank Spotnitz. And I think that his interview is worth a listen. And by the way, some people are like, Rob, why do I have to listen to you read these articles? Look, you wouldn't read it on your own. You wouldn't. You know you wouldn't. You wouldn't even find it. You wouldn't even make these connections. And I'm not saying that's a fault of your own. You're just not thinking the same way I think. And perhaps nobody should think the way I think. I don't know. But anyway, let's read this article that Cole Haddon, he interviewed Frank Spotnitz. It's a fascinating read, and I'm going to share it with you. Q&A. TV showrunner Frank Spotnitz on what he's learned from trading Hollywood for Europe. One of the defining voices of the X-Files, the writer-producer transplanted his family to the UK a decade ago, and in doing so, reimagined both his life and career. Again, this is by Cole Haddon. He published this 3 days ago on Medium in their Fanfare section. 7 or so years ago, can't even start. 7 or so years ago, I was anxiously preparing to move to the United Kingdom. It was a confusing and anxiety-ridden time as almost every element of this move seemed daily undermined by forces beyond my control. A persistent dread had manifested around the question, would the geography of the international TV market in Europe prove unwelcoming to me despite my ambition to transplant much of my writing career from Los Angeles to London and the continent? A friend at the Writers Guild of America suggested I speak to Frank, about this, as he was an expert on all such matters, having already moved his own family and career to Europe a few years earlier. This is Cole Haddon speaking, by the way. My friend was referring to Frank Spotnitz, one of the defining voices of the X-Files. The problem was, Frank and I had never actually met. Well, you should have gone to the Saturn Awards, bro. I immediately cold emailed him and got a reply 12 hours later. I just looked it up for reference. I'd very much like to meet you and offer you any and all support that I can, he had written back. He meant that, too. We were on the phone a day later for more than an hour. Upon my arrival in London, he took me out for a spectacular dinner. He has excellent taste in restaurants, and ever since, he has repeatedly and without reservation offered me whatever he could to make my life easier and better. He is an excellent friend. For this artist-on-artist conversation, Frank and I decided to tackle his life in Europe and the career he rebooted there as a prolific television creator and producer as head of Big Light Productions. But first, you have to understand how extraordinary this geographical change was for someone in his position. By the time he left the States, he'd written on The X-Files and co-created its spin-off, The Lone Gunman, as well as co-wrote the story for the film The X-Files, and he co-wrote the screenplay for its sequel, X-Files, I Want to Believe. Frank. I'm sorry. Just kidding. He'd created more TV series, too, including Night Stalker, based on one of his favorite series of all time, Kolchak the Night Stalker, but the network didn't want monsters. This is the state of Hollywood. Hey, let's reboot Kolchak the Night Stalker, but can you remove the monsters? By the way, said by people that don't know fuck all about anything. If you're rebooting Kolchak the Night Stalker and you've never seen an episode of the show, fuck you! Anyway, he created more TV series, too. He was established, proven, and respected. Tossing all that aside to make TV overseas instead was a huge risk. But in the end, it paid off. Since his move to London, which was followed by one to Paris and then another back to London, Frank has created the Emmy-nominated The Man in the High Castle and co-created Ransom, Medici, Masters of Florence, and its sequel, Medici the Magnificent, The Indian Detective, and Leonardo. All of these were produced under his Big Light banner, along with numerous other series. We'll discuss what he's learned from this international experience as much as a person, as a filmmaker. For television writers, I would especially pay special attention to the differences Frank identifies between how TV is written and produced in the UK, Europe, and Hollywood, as well as his thoughts about the value of writers' rooms and collaboration. Our writer, Cole Haddon, asks, Frank, we're odd ducks in that we traded our lives in Hollywood to live and primarily work abroad. Since doing so, you've written and produced many hours of television in a variety of European countries that all buy, develop, and produce TV series differently than the U.S. does. What I'd love to do is interrogate what drove you overseas and what that adventure, both personally and creatively, has taught you. Along the way, maybe we can discuss the pros and cons of the U.S. system in the context of the European system. So what do you say? Frank Spotnitz says, sounds great. I left the States 13 years ago, and it's been quite a ride. I don't regret a single minute of it. The experience has enriched my life in countless ways that I could never have imagined, but I'd say this kind of adventure is not for the faint of heart. Cole Haddon says, let's start with the decision to move abroad. You had, as far as I can tell, a thriving career in U.S. television. You'd played a huge part in The X-Files, its spin-offs, and the films. You had other TV series hit the air, too. What happened to make you trade all of that for a new start in Europe? Frank Spotnitz says, I'd been meeting with a wonderful British producer named Stephen Garrett every year since 2002. He would come out to Los Angeles, we'd have coffee, and he would always ask me about coming to the UK to do a series. I'd lived in Paris in my 20s, and the idea of living and working in Europe was really appealing to me. So I always told Stephen that I was interested, but in truth, I couldn't see how it would ever come to pass. Then the Writers Guild of America strike in 2007-2008 happened. After it ended, I found that the studios were offering me half of my previous quote to develop. Suddenly, the idea of going to the UK, where my upfront fees would be lower, but in success, my back end would be really and truly meaningful, seemed like not such a bad idea. Suddenly, the idea of going to the UK, where my upfront fees would be lower, but in success, my back end would really and truly be meaningful, seemed like not such a bad idea. I guess that was a duplicate, but I read it anyway. When you and your family made that leap, did you feel at the time you were all in, or was it more of a long-term holiday in Europe you were willing to be labeled a fun experience if it didn't work out? I know when, oops, I don't mean to do that. I know, God damn it, you people. Ugh. If it didn't work out, I know when I did it, this was 2017, not long before we first met in person, I was an all or nothing thing. It was an all or nothing thing. I think that I was afraid if I had a parachute, I'd always be looking back. It's like when Cortez went to the New World. He burned his ships. Frank Spotnitz says, I wasn't all in. My wife and I expected we would stay in London for at least 2 years and maybe as long as 5, depending on how long the series lasted, but we never reached the point where we felt confident enough to buy a house. We've been renting for the past 13 years, which I now look back on with some chagrin. Cole Haddon says, I have to ask, what did your U.S. reps and friends think of the move? Were there a lot of attempts to dissuade you from blowing your career up? Frank Spotnitz says, my American attorney was quite upset with me, I'll bet. I think he felt he'd invested all of his time in my career, and here I was abandoning it by going off to Europe. I ended up getting a new lawyer, while my agent and the William Morris agency stuck with me 100%. For years, I've heard from him and many others that I was way ahead of the curve, seeing opportunities in Europe before anyone else. I'd like to say it was true, but honestly, I didn't think about it that way. Looking back on it now, I can't believe the risk I took. When I left Hollywood, I still had deals in place for 2 different series with HBO. Going to Europe was like jumping off a cliff, trusting there would be some kind of water to land in. It turned out that there was a whole ocean waiting for me, or at least the Mediterranean Sea. Cole Haddon says, for context, where did you grow up? Where was your identity primarily formed before you arrived in Los Angeles, and what was that transition like by comparison? Frank Spotnitz says, my dad was a doctor in the Army, and I was born on an Army base in Japan and moved first to Colorado and then to Pennsylvania before he retired from the service and went into private practice in Phoenix when I was 7. I was the youngest of 5 boys with a 5-year age gap between me and my next oldest brother, so I ended up spending a lot of time by myself growing up. Movies and TV were pretty much everything to me. I watched everything, just everything, and I would often sit through the same movie 2 or 3 times in a row. I hear that. To take in as much of it as I could. There was no question in my mind what I wanted to do with my life when I grew up. I graduated from high school early to go to UCLA, intent on studying film, but my brother Tom died by suicide a few weeks after my 18th birthday. It completely wrecked me in ways that I wouldn't come to understand until many years later. I didn't know that. I'm sorry to hear that, Frank. I watched everything, just everything, and I would often sit through the same movie 2 or 3 times in a row. Cole Haddon says, I can't even begin to imagine. One immediate effect was that I ended up giving up on my dreams of Hollywood. Instead, I became the editor of the UCLA paper, and after graduating, a reporter for the wire service, UPI in Indianapolis in New York, and the AP in Paris. That was 7 years of my life. Look, there's Frank in Paris. Actually, in Europe, that's probably not Paris, but maybe Rome, maybe, I don't know, somewhere else. Cole Haddon asks, what changed? How'd you wake up from the trauma? Frank Spotnitz says, around 1988, I began to realize that I was essentially running away from myself. I decided to move back to Los Angeles and obtain an MFA in screenwriting at the American Film Institute. Fortunately for me, The X-Files was my first job after graduating from film school. I was already 33 years old at that point, so it felt to me that I didn't have any time to waste, and as it turned out, that show was the perfect job for me. Look at this. Vince Gilligan and Frank Spotnitz, man. Look at you guys. Look at how young Vince Gilligan was. Wow. Frank Spotnitz goes on to say, I had the same influences Chris Carter had growing up, and it just clicked with me on a deep level. I ended up becoming the president of Chris's production company and wrote and produced 3 other series with him, as well as both X-Files movies. I found my footing in life relatively late, but I think I benefited from spending all of those years in my 20s as a reporter. I saw and learned a lot about the world, and it gave me a chance to grow up and mature a bit before turning my hand to writing and producing. Cole Haddon asks, how did you find the adjustment to Europe then after your life in Hollywood? Frank says, moving to London was probably less of a shock for me than it was for my family, since I'd already lived in Paris for 2 years in my 20s. But it was still a culture shock. In the beginning, you just noticed all the small, everyday things that are different. The accents, the vocabulary and spellings, the groceries, the light sockets, and so on. Then gradually you start to become aware of how profoundly different the culture is, how differently people think. It starts to give you a perspective on your country and yourself that you would never have if you stayed home. Cole Haddon goes on and says, one of the cultural adjustments I valued so much about my move was the twofold experience of walking everywhere and walking everywhere through beauty. I hate driving in general, being on edge like that, especially in LA, which is terrifying, but walking, the tube or the metro, taking subways everywhere, freed up all this emotional and creative space. And the beauty, the effort, Europe's past put into aesthetics alongside utilitarianism and everything, meant every city, even the towns and villages outside them, were open-air museums to inspire me. I wonder, how do you think London and later Paris impacted your consciousness and maybe even your mental health? I love living in LA and still have many close friends there, but looking back, I think it was kind of a cocoon. Frank Spotnitz says, I had the same experience. I loved living in Los Angeles and still have many close friends there, but looking back on it, I think I was in kind of a cocoon. I would leave my nice house, get in my nice car, drive to my nice office or restaurant or wherever, and then drive back to my nice house again. To some degree, I was disconnected from everyday life, from real life, and from other people. I loved coming to London and later Paris, where we lived for 7 years before returning here in 2021, and not just because they're walking cities, though that's a big reason to be sure. I love that they brought me into daily contact with the rhythm of life, with strangers and people living very different experiences from my own. Frank Spotnitz goes on and says, like you, I'm constantly amazed by the incredible beauty here. You're right. The whole continent sometimes seems like one big open-air museum. I can't think of anything more pleasant than simply walking in Paris on a nice day with no particular place to be. Being a flaneur. It's just indescribably wonderful. Not that I do it that often. I don't say this to serve any political agenda, but I have to say that I've always been struck not just by the beauty, but by the silent tragedy of it all. So many of the treasures we enjoy were paid for by ruthlessly exploiting people in other countries for centuries. We can't undo that, but we can at least acknowledge it. Cole Haddon says, this is a problem I had with London in particular. The fact that so much of it was paid for by the crimes and genocidal exploitation of India, but there are a few plaques around or signs along the street explaining what the East India Trading Company did to produce these historical monuments and areas like Canary Wharf. So let's talk about writers' rooms. You arrived in the UK as British and European television was only just beginning to experiment with them, which were once upon a time a uniquely American way of writing TV. What do you think were the strengths of the single writer approach that preceded this, and how do you think the evolution toward writers' rooms has helped or even hurt what these markets create? To me, it's not about whether you literally work in a writer's room or not. It's about the values that a room implies. Collaboration in service to doing the best work possible. Frank Spotnitz says, I've been a passionate and vocal supporter of writers' rooms. I've used them on so many shows that I've done in Europe, and I've accepted just about every invitation that I've ever received to speak about writers' rooms all over the continent. For the past 10 years, I've taught at a program in Berlin called Serial Eyes that trains 12 working writers each year to collaborate, work in rooms, and think of themselves as writer-producers, not just writers. To me, it's not about whether you literally work in a room or not. It's about the value that a room implies. Which is, says Cole Haddon, Frank says, collaboration in service to doing the best work possible. Here's Frank in that serialized room with the students in 2020. Frank Spotnitz says, there are clear reasons to me why the model emerged in the United States and not anywhere else. We are a purely commercial culture. And for decades, it was all... This is, by the way, this is kind of why I wanted to read this on this show. And what he's saying here about entertainment, I think, is the entire problem with Hollywood, with all of our IPs and everything that's going on right now. So listen to what he says here, because I think it's really, really important. Frank Spotnitz says, there are clear reasons to me why the model emerged in the United States and not anywhere else. We are a purely commercial culture. And for decades, it was all about network television, where you had to produce 24 episodes a year. There's really no sensible way to do that without a writer's room. Whereas in the rest of the world, excepting the soaps like Coronation Street or EastEnders, television series tend to have much shorter orders. In the UK, it could be a single or 2 or 3 or 4 episodes. 6 is a lot. 8 is a really big swing. They aren't going to waste money by pulling a produced show off the air if it's not performing. So they can't afford failure and don't want to take the risk of ordering 10 or 12 episodes of a series. If you're doing a series of less than 8 episodes, then of course you don't need a writer's room. The proof is the greatness of British television, and countless other series are produced all over the world with a single writer or with a small group of writers working separately. But if you're doing 8 or 10 episodes or more, then I think you'd be well advised to use a writer's room. And even if you aren't, I think you should think hard about the value of collaboration and how it enhances the entire process of making television. Were there any major points of narrative diversion from how U.S. television tells stories that you found shocking or challenging to amalgamate with how you were trained or even prefer to tell stories? I guess what I'm really asking, says Cole Haddon, is how truly different is TV storytelling in the UK and Europe from the US after all? Frank Spotnitz says, oh gosh, it's so different. Being American is a very different thing than being British or French or Italian or whatever. We have a very commercial sensibility, and that's good in a lot of ways because it means our shows are designed to be entertaining and reach wide audiences. That's part of the reason that historically they have performed so well all over the world. British and European shows tend to be more grounded, less about plot, less high concept, more about character. But the goal in the UK and much of Europe, at least until recently, but I still think it's still partly true, has been less about being popular than about being good. The BBC is, after all, a cultural service, paid for by mandatory license fee. They have a cultural mandate to serve British audiences, and that's a very different thing than just reaching for a big audience. And I think, generally speaking, and forgive me, this is a vast generalization that you could find many exceptions to, British and European shows tend to be more grounded, less about plot, less about high concept, more about character, which I admire, even if I don't always enjoy it as much as an American series. So, Frank, I apologize for being that guy. And listening to you speak to Cole Haddon in this article, I have a whole newfound respect for you, sir. And maybe one day if I come to London, I'll find the lovely Emma Bannon and we'll take you out and get you hammered in Soho, because I look forward to that with Emma. But anyway, I don't know where this episode of Robservations was going. You know, there's really not much to talk about in terms of where the entertainment business is going. But I wanted to talk about these things tonight. Call me crazy. Don't know if it has any value to you. Don't know what I've said. Maybe I've made funny faces. But let's see what you guys have to say, or if anybody has anything to say, because I don't know. I mean, I might have been, calling, maybe everybody's just tuned out. I have no idea. But let's see. The Dead Man says, hello, Chief Running Mouth. Happy birthday. Well, Dead Man, you remember the channel, and I thank you for that. Kenneth Colton says, thank you for wishing me a happy birthday yesterday, Rob. As I turned 41, I look back on the greatness you have brought us, and I salute you, sir. Well, Kenneth, that's very nice of you to say. I hope your next twirl around our sun is your very best yet. Thank you so much. The Dead Man says, I still have the first X-Files comic. The value hasn't changed in 20 years. Laugh out loud. Well, you know what? You don't buy comics for their value. You buy comics to read them. Tom Jr. Jackson says, happy birthday, Rob. I was informed by Sentai Ranger Donnie. Donnie says, hashtag save the Power Rangers. That Free Enterprise is streaming on Plex. Did you know this? Well, it shouldn't be. Whatever is streaming on Plex is in the wrong aspect ratio, and it's not the right version of the film. So, not good. That's not good. And anybody who's watching it on Plex, shame on you. It shouldn't be there. Thomas Logan says, Terry O'Quinn dying after 5 minutes was a bad omen. Joey Skellington says, Reign of Fire is a guilty pleasure. The CGI looks better than most films these days, and I love seeing it at the drive-in when I was 10. You're probably right. Darth Dragonborn says, where's my 4K Last Samurai, bruv? I don't know, man. I want it. Thomas Logan says, Bobby, please do the Spotnitz scream again for us. Thomas, I've done it so much. I think I've done it too much. Tony Reyes says, Rob, my wife and I are celebrating our 2-year anniversary this weekend. We'll be kicking off our celebration watching Superman, the Christopher Reeve documentary. Oh, you'll love that. So emotional. Looking forward to your 1000th episode. Stay frosty. Tony Reyes is a imagination connoisseur we should always aspire to. Not only is his wife stunningly beautiful, she lets him buy and build Gundam models. That's like having a wife. For those who don't know what Gundam models are, that's like having a really hot wife that lets you buy Warhammer and paint it and not care because she knows you love it. RRTNZ all the way down from down under. Hail Bob the Great. Mike Clobby Alonso reviewed the Kolchak series shortly before his sad passing. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Hope you're well. Cheers. I am well. Thank you for that. RRTNZ goes on to say, in my humble opinion, Fringe was better than the X-Files. It changed its premise every season. But okay. I'll give it to you. Fringe was good. I like Fringe. Despite the people that made it, I liked it. I met John Noble this year, and he was an awesome dude. Would slip into character, Walter and Denethor, just to make us smile. He was the nicest guy. Thomas Logan says, you do the scream for Frank, and he starts convulsing. To be fair, I never did that for him, which is probably for the best. Yeah, it wasn't good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, kind souls, gentle beings, I think I have nothing more to say. I just want to do this show. I'm going to go back to editing True Noir. And, it's kind of a random thing. I just read this article that Cole Haddon wrote. And by the way, Cole Haddon wrote this book, Psalms for the End of the World. You should get it. Also, and I'll show these later, but Upper Deck, if you collect trading cards, has done a great Monsters series of cards from the X-Files. And it's very cool, and I'll show them later. Tomorrow, probably. But I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank everybody for indulging me in this crazy show. I want to thank all of you who are members of the channel, everyone who supports this channel via Super Chats and tips. I want to thank, Kevin, one of two. Kevin says, Rob, how do filmmakers such as yourself bake current event topics and commentary into their stories without them feeling forced? Well, Kevin, the word you want is allegory. Allegory. Know it. Learn it. Love it. Allegory is the best way to bake topics into your stories without feeling didactic and heavy-handed. It works well. That's I think the best way to do it. Classic Star Trek was very allegorical. The problem is, here's the problem. If you're baking modern political stories and you are too on the nose, it dates your project. I mean, Stacey Abrams is the president of the world in Star Trek Discovery. Not so good. Kevin goes on to say, 2 of 2, Miami Vice's Season 1, Episode 22, Evan, deals with Sonny's failure to protect a cop who had been bullied into suicide due to his sexuality. How did writing from 40 years ago feel more organic? Well, because the people that were writing it here's what they didn't do. They didn't start and go, well, I'm an activist, and I think that, the LGBTQ people are always at risk of so we have to do something that no. The thing about that story, and by the way, it's a great episode. I love Miami Vice. The first season's great. First 2 seasons are great. Is it didn't matter whether that character was gay, Christian. It didn't matter what his identity was. That story was universal. We all understand that there are all kinds of people have elements about their personality they either can't show, that isn't acceptable, or whatever. They understood that the idea of somebody wanting acceptance for who and what they are, even though what they are might not be something that society at large wants, that is a universal story. So what you do is you focus on the universality of it, the actual details of it, to make it about an LGBTQ story is great. And to see it makes Sonny, the fact that Sonny is an ally and an advocate, made it even better. But the story itself is about, what does the alienation mean? Nowadays, they would come in and say, this story is a gay story. We have a gay character. And it's like, the thing is, whether you're talking about gay or trans people, you're talking about a very significantly small part of the population. But everybody understands what it means to be alienated and what it means to be an outsider. So what you try and do is turn a story, the specificity of an LGBTQ story matters, certainly. But what you want to do is take that and make it universal. And it's not a story that just appeals to anyone who's LGBTQ. You want to tell a story that anybody can understand. And that's the difference. What they've done is they've put the identity ahead of the story. And the identity, unfortunately, when you're doing that, you're alienating most of your audience that aren't part of that identity. What you want to do is you want to tell a story that deals with that identity, but is a universal story. I know it's a small distinction, but it's a distinction that makes your story work with all audiences. So it's kind of like Philadelphia. I always go back to Jonathan Demme's Philadelphia. He made it after Silence of the Lambs, but Tom Hanks plays a gay lawyer who has been discriminated against at his own firm and hires Denzel Washington to defend him. And in the movie, he's dying of AIDS, and at the time, people forget what AIDS meant and what a stigma it was. But in making that film, when you're watching the movie, you love Tom Hanks. You're not thinking, well, he's a gay man and whatever. No. Yeah, he's gay, and yeah, he's dying of AIDS. We all understand that. But in that film, he's so humanized, and Denzel Washington, a black man, comes to represent all of the audience. We are all Denzel. We all feel exactly the same way he does. But in getting to know the Tom Hanks character, you love that guy and you come to respect the character just like Denzel does. That's why that movie's, look, people can say it's a little heavy-handed. And maybe it is. But at the time, it changed the perception of gay men in the entire universe. That movie, the importance of that movie at the time it came out cannot be understated. It was so important. And the way that movie is conceived and designed is brilliant. And if you want to see a movie, that movie is a total activist movie. Totally activist. But you know what? It understands what it needs to do to appeal to the every person. And it does it beautifully. Bruce Springsteen singing the theme song. I'm telling you, to me, if somebody wants to go back and look at an issue-oriented film, look at Philadelphia, think about the time it came out. It's 30 years old, 31 years old now. Brilliantly done. It's a brilliantly done movie that wears its activism and its point on its sleeve, but it also understands you have to spin a narrative that makes John Q. Public or Joan Q. Public buy in. Brilliant. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Coach Sipping Jamba Juice says, I know you're not a sitcom guy, but last Friday was the 40th anniversary of The Cosby Show. I grew up on sitcoms, and I really miss when they made great ones like the ones from the 80s and 90s. I agree with you. I think they did. The Cosby Show was a great, despite, take your artists away from the show, it was a great show. And by the way, Bill Cosby was America's dad. Who knew that he had more in common with P. Diddy? If you get rich and famous, you got to still be a nice person. Otherwise, yeah, it's not good. But it was a great. Sitcoms are great. I mean, I think go back to you talk about the 80s and 90s, 70s sitcoms are incredible too. I mean, Laverne and Shirley, Happy Days, The Jeffersons, All in the Family. There was some great Mary Tyler Moore, great sitcoms, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So, Coach sipping Jamba Juice, you guys, you're right. You're absolutely right. And on that note, I want to thank you all for being here. Thanks for going on the journey with me tonight, wherever that was. Hope it had some value, because I certainly didn't plan this, but it was fun. And thank you for coming along. Very much appreciate it. And remember, every person you meet has a story to tell that you have yet to hear. And all you have to do is listen. And with that, I say to everybody, have a better night and a better tomorrow.